So today we're going to talk about a topic that I think is one of your favorites, and I think you're going to have a lot to talk about. And I don't need to ask that many questions, and that is the topic of morality.
Mm-hmm.
And that has so many implications in our daily lives. It has so many practical implications, and I think it's not so much as a philosophical, ethereal concept as the other ones that we talked about. So I'd like to start with some concepts, and I'd like you to elaborate on whether there are such things as moral facts or moral realism, and what is objective moral reasoning, and why do we need it?
Well, I think to start, a person's worldview or what they believe about the world dictates their moral compass, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It all depends on, I think, the age group that you talk to or speak with. If you speak with a lot of millennials, or that generation that came after the millennials, I can't remember the name of that generation, but people in their late teens and early 20s, they'll have a different answer than maybe possibly the millennials. And then the generation that's older than the millennials, they'll have a different answer. And then I think it also can change depending on what group you belong to. If you're an atheist or not a religious person, you'll get one set of answers. You talk to a religious person, you get a different set of answers. But no matter how you look at it, I'll give you a personal story. There's a guy that I used to work with. And he came up to me one day and he says, "Justin, I have come up with a mathematical equation for why we should not care if people steal from work." And before he could give me the mathematical equation, I said, "And how long did it take you to come up with this?" He said, "An hour." I said, "That was probably the biggest waste of an hour." I said, "That is ridiculous." I said, "That is a ridiculous equation." He says, "Well, why is it ridiculous?" I says, "Because if you were to take that equation and apply it to you, you would care. If I were to take that mathematical equation and live by it, would you still not care if I came into your house and stole your personal belongings?" And then he goes, "But we have to leave morals out of it." I said, "But that's the problem. You can't leave morality out of it." I said, you value your things, your personal things. And I know the stuff that he's into. He's into like his stereo equipment and his sound system. I said, if I came into your house and stole all of it, and then you asked me why I stole from you, and I said, and my response was, well, you gave me a mathematical equation for why we shouldn't care if people steal. So you cannot get away from a moral framework. If you talk to the average atheist or the average moral relativist, they'll say that morals are subjective and we make them up as we go, but they live in contradiction to that because they don't actually live that way. They'll tell you that everything is subjective until it applies to them.
For sure, rejecting morality is basically rejecting a consistent lifestyle because you cannot operate based on subjective morality. Mm-hmm. And it just works when it comes to your own interests, but it doesn't really work when everybody does the same thing, because at some point it does eventually lead to interferences and restrictions in your own freedoms and rights if mm-hmm. everybody will do whatever they want.
Yeah, and so it's funny because they will advocate this and say, "Oh, well, we just make up our own morals, and we just make up this, and we discovered this and this, and and they'll go on about it." But the second something is
Yeah.
done to them, some kind of wrong is done to them, then they will switch to an objective morality and want justice.
Exactly. I would like to lead the conversation to the realm of education. It's very interesting how moral relativism has penetrated most areas of science, like human science or liberal arts. And it's is this confusion that truth has to be equal to proof. You have to prove something in order for it to be true. Whereas a lot of things are true, even though they cannot be proven true. So that there's this ongoing confusion, and I'm very curious how that infiltrated the system, because that's kind of new. And moral relativism is not something very common in the whole history of philosophy. I mean, there's very few philosophers that actually adhere to this concept. And I can actually mention Protagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher. He issued this statement that is very famous: man is the measure of all things, which ends up in a circular reasoning. Because if you don't have a higher authority, you're your own law, you're not going to end well in practice, because you're going to eventually do something that hurts somebody else. But it's very interesting why that happened. What are the causes of it? I mean, is it naturalism? Is the Darwinian theory influencing almost everything in the academia? Because that obviously implies the fact that morality is just a means to an end. It's an instrument for survival. It just helps the individual better adapt and cooperate in a social group.
Well, if you take the statement, there's no such thing as truth. If that statement is actually true, then we've just arrived at truth. So truth is inescapable. Something's either true or false. You can't. What is it? So there's the three fundamental laws of logic. You've got. It's a little early for me, so my brain's not quite working. You have the law of non-contradiction. You have the law of identity, and you have the law of excluded middle. Either a proposition is true or it's false. It can't be both. So it's objectively true that where I'm sitting right now is probably below 70 degrees outside. I'd say it might be in the high 50s right now. I haven't checked the temperature, but I know for a fact that it's below 70 degrees. That's objectively true. If everybody in the world denied that, it doesn't change the fact that it's below 70 degrees outside where I'm at. So to say that you have to prove, okay, I'm having thoughts about what I'm talking about. I can't prove that I'm having thoughts. I can't show you, like on a computer screen or some kind of a projector, that I'm having thoughts. And you only hear this from, it seems to me, from people that embrace atheism or moral relativism. But there's lots of things that you can't see, that you can't see. Like energy. You can't see energy. I can't see your thoughts, like physically see them. But we know that we have thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can talk about, including the axioms. Even in mathematics, when you say that a line is made up of an infinity of dots, you can't actually prove that by mathematical means. You can't have an equation or a calculus, an algorithm to prove that, but it makes perfect sense. With your intuition, you can actually understand that. And that's what I wanted to get to the subject of the intuition. And actually, the deepest truths about life are things that cannot be proven. Is that correct? What do you think?
Well, when someone says they can't be proven, well, what do they mean by that?
By a scientific method, as in the lab, you can measure that with an instrument. Like you can measure love, you can't measure somebody's goodness. Or
here's the problem with that, though. Science doesn't deal with morality. Those are philosophical propositions. Okay, science doesn't deal with morality or philosophical issues. That is where the realm of philosophy comes into play. The problem that I think scientists and atheists are making is they're trying to say that science can answer all of the questions of life, and it can't. So when you start trying to use science, and I could be wrong because I'm not an expert in this area, but when you try to say from a scientific single vision view on life, and you try to take science and you try to say, and you start taking science and you start moving it into the realm of morality and philosophy, or just let's just say morality, I think that's the mistake that science is making. I think science is great in a lot of ways, but the moment you start talking about love and morals and feelings, those that's philosophy. That's the realm of philosophy and philosophical thinking. And I think that there are good philosophical arguments to show certain things to be true. I don't have to have a physical object like this water bottle to know that things like love exists, or to know that thoughts are real and feelings are, or I have a feeling about the weather. You know what I'm saying? You can't, science can't answer everything in all areas of life. Science is great for coming up with cures for diseases, and figuring out how something works, those kinds of things. But I think they're making a huge mistake when they say that science can come up with all the answers for everything in life. I hope that kind of addresses what you asked.
Yeah, exactly. It really does. Because rejecting morality and trying to explain it by means of science is basically a consequence of the rejection of God. That's in the academic world. You reject God as the cause and reason for all existence, and therefore you have to explain everything else by scientific means, and just look at the material world and try to come up with explanations for everything, but it just doesn't work. It makes no sense, and you get into this vicious circle, like circle reasoning. You just eat your own tail in the end. And I find it very relevant. Richard Dawkins, I think everybody's familiar with Richard Dawkins, who's a fervent anti-creationist. I'm going to read this quote because I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about. He says in The Descent of Man, episode 1, I'm a passionate Darwinian when it comes to science, when it comes to explaining the world, but I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to morality and politics. So even Dawkins admits that there's actually no basis for morality in science, but if we don't have moral rules in society, then everything is going to collapse.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember a story that I heard probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was told by Ravi Zacharias. And he was talking about love. And he was talking about the different Greek words for love: agape, storge, phileo or phileos, and eros love, which is kind of connected to like a romantic love. And he said there's a thing called a supererogatory act. And he was telling about I remember when this actually happened. There was an Amtrak. I can't remember what part of the country it was in, but I think I want to say it was like closer to like the East Coast of the United States. And the Amtrak train had derailed and crashed. And there was a couple who had a daughter in a wheelchair with cerebral palsy. Now, obviously, someone with cerebral palsy, they're very limited in what they can do, and they need a lot of assistance and that kind of thing. But Robbie's point is what would cause the parents of that child to do what they did, and this is what they did, is the train had crashed. It crashed into like a river or some kind of small body of water. And what the parents had done is they had lifted the wheelchair up high enough that the workers or rescuers could get their daughter out, and they ended up dying in the process. So they had given their life up to save the life of their daughter with cerebral palsy. So Robbie's point is what causes that type of emotion or desire to love somebody so much that you're willing to give your life up for it? He says, where does that come from? Science can't measure that. You can't put that in one other thing he said, as he was talking to one atheist once, he said, what scientific theory defines love for you? What scientific theory tells you should be honest when you're doing your taxes at the end of the year? And
that completely contradicts the Darwinian paradigm completely, because it's not the survival of the fittest. It's not the survival of the individual. It's not self-preservation.
And that was his point. He says, here is a young child who was severely handicapped due to cerebral palsy. And yet here's two healthy, functioning adults. They sacrificed their own life to save their daughter who was handicapped and in a wheelchair. That type of love, he says, where does that come from? That type of sacrificial love, where does that come from? And he said, you can't measure that in the scientific realm in the terms of science. And so I think that science, or when I say science, I mean atheists, make a huge mistake when they try to say that they can answer this with scientific methods.
Exactly. And it just goes back to what we initially started talking about, that truth is not the equivalent of proof. And then by means of consequence, there's another confusion in the scientific world or in the academic world or in the education, because it also concerns small children. They're taught what is fact and what is belief. And this idea is inoculated since a very early age that beliefs are not facts. So that the area of beliefs encompasses also includes also the realm of morality. So there's this dichotomy that is made quite evident, and it's penetrating their minds and mentality and sticks there. And it's very dangerous. And I think has everything to do with the Darwinian theory, since it started being taken as an absolute truth. And therefore, everything that is measurable, everything that is related to matter, that is truth and that is fact. But everything else that we feel, that we think and believe is not true, because we cannot prove it in the lab. It cannot be measured by instruments. But that is absolutely false, because in reality, it has no applicability. I mean, it just doesn't work.
Well, I remember when I was 7, I didn't grow up in a religious home. My dad hated religion, actually. Even though he was born Greek Orthodox, he hated religion. So he never talked about it. He never did. But I remember when I was about 7 or 8, maybe 7, there used to be a store called Grand Central. And it was kind of like a Target. Have you ever heard of Target? And I had walked into the store and I stole a package of gum. And as soon as I walked out, I felt incredibly guilty. Don't know why, I just did. I turned around, walked back in there, set it back on the shelf and left. And I still felt guilty. So I believe, and this point, I don't ever remember a point where my dad said that stealing was wrong, ever. When I got home, I told him what I had done, and I told him how I felt. And he said, well, stealing's wrong. I said, why? He goes, well, it just is. So the sense of morality is self-evident. It's just, you just know it. And so a lot of atheists will say, well, the reason you feel that stealing is wrong is because, you grew up in a religious home and you were indoctrinated with this and you were told this your whole life and blah, 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 blah. And I've actually had atheists say this to me. And I said, well, no, you're wrong. I didn't grow up in a religious home at all. I had never stepped foot in a church until I was in my, I want to say early mid-20s. That was through the influence of my late Uncle John. I said, but I didn't grow up in a religious home. And they usually don't have much of a response after that. So I said, so why did I feel guilty about stealing that package of gum at the age of 7?
Exactly. There's such a thing as natural laws, and moral laws. And I mean, I actually wanted to go back to start first because what you said is exactly, it's really fitting. Romans 2:14. And I will read it. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. So because we have a conscience, it's something that we cannot prove, but we all have it. Everybody has a sense of what is right and what is wrong, and that's God-given. We have this moral laws that are naturally inoculated in us, and we have them ever since we're born, because we are created in the image of God. And through the prism of Christianity, we can explain this beautifully and exhaustively. However, outside of Christianity, it's very hard to explain these things. And obviously, there are some influences that can deteriorate the sense of good or evil, such as like bad influences from the culture or a bad family. But you still have a sense of what is wrong and what is good, regardless of culture, regardless of the moment in time. I mean, regardless of history. I think ever since we have recorded history, we can track down people who thought that killing babies was evil, except for some cultures. But so all have this sense of good and evil and this moral laws within us, and that is in the realm of our intuition and our conscience. And these things, they do exist because we all feel them, we all experience them, but they cannot be explained by science. So therefore, it has to be a metaphysical explanation for that. It also implies the fact that there has to be a realm of metaphysics, not just the physical reality.
Yeah, and that's, I think, where science falls short. That I remember another lecture from Ravi Zacharias, and he was talking about morality with an atheist. And he asked the atheist if he believed in such a thing as evil. And he said yes, he said it was because of evil why he couldn't believe God exists. Well, then he asked him, he says, well, do you assume that there is good? And he said, well, yes. And he says, okay, you assume evil, you assume good. He says, is it safe to assume that that there's a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He said the atheist kind of struggled a little bit with it. And he said, yes. He says, okay, so you believe the evil exists. You assume good exists. And he says, you assume a moral law exists on the basis of which to distinguish between the two. He said, yes. He says, okay, well, if you assume a moral law, you have to posit a moral lawgiver. If there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. He says, if there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. Greg Koukl said, if God doesn't exist, morality has no basis in anything. I think that's how he said it. But yeah, morality doesn't exist.
But morality does exist because
It does,
we all
yes.
have a sense of morality, and it's everywhere, ubiquitous in practice. And if morality exists, then morality needs to have a cause. And if we're all just a sum of atoms and are just simply matter, morality cannot exist because morality is only relatable to persons. It's a realm of the personhood, if I can say that. So the cause of morality has to be another person that is higher than us, like a higher authority. It has nothing to do with matter or the laws of nature.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, if we're just as Frank Turek puts it, moist robots or balls of meat wandering around in a meaningless universe, then yeah, morality doesn't exist. And science doesn't deal with morality, even though they'll try to say that morality is genetically determined. But if we're the product of evolutionary biology, it still doesn't, it still doesn't answer the question of why we should be good to one another, or why we should be honest to somebody, or why, murder is wrong, or, all those kinds of things. It still doesn't answer it. There's no justification for anything. If atheism is true, then I don't think anybody has the right to condemn anybody for anything that they view wrong, because it's just a matter of morality. Basically becomes a matter of opinion. And I said to one atheist once, I says, if God doesn't exist, then morality is an opinion, and whose opinion are we going to choose to live by, Mother Teresa's or Hitler's? Because that's really all it is an opinion. It's a subjective opinion. And the conversation kept going in a circle, but that was my point. It's just, I said to him, even our conversation is meaningless. There's no meaning to it. There's no purpose to it. It doesn't.
Yeah.
But no matter how hard the atheist wants to eliminate an objective moral law, they still live by one, even though they may not want to admit it.
For sure. Since we have only about 4 minutes left, I would like to ask a final question, which is quite hard to answer within such a short amount of time. Mm-hmm. But I think it's really relevant if you can find your most powerful argument. Why do you think Christianity is superior to every other worldview in explaining morality, in setting standards for morality?
Okay, well, here's what I think the answer to that is this. You take the cosmological argument that William Lane Craig is really good at explaining. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. You take that argument, you take the ontological argument, you take the moral argument, okay? You take those philosophical arguments, and then you take Jesus of Nazareth, the evidence for his bodily resurrection from the dead. So it's not, it's a connected series of arguments. So you take those philosophical arguments, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the moral argument, and even the contingency argument. Mm-hmm. Then you take Jesus' bodily resurrection from the dead. You look at the historical data. There's good historical data that proves that he rose from the dead. Okay. Because he rose from the dead historically, bodily, it validates and proves everything else that he said in the New Testament. He also affirmed the Old Testament as authoritative. And Christ talked about morality. He talked about the moral law. He says, if you hate your brother, you have already committed murder in your heart. So he had taken that law and he'd put it on a higher plane. He talked about lust. If you look at another woman and lusted after her, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. He talked about the heart. He talked about morality. So you take, like I said, it's a connected series of arguments. You take all those arguments and you put it together. I think the case for Christianity is the strongest.
That is beautifully put. And before we conclude, I would ask you whether you have one book suggestion for our audience, and then we will conclude.
One, I really like Dr. William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith. That's one great. I would recommend. Yeah, it's a great book.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. We'll have to conclude now. Thank you for joining. It was a wonderful talk today. Next time we'll talk about destiny. That's an interesting topic.
Oh, yeah.